My name is Seraphina, the Masked Lady. I was once human. Since then, I have lived many lives. I have been loved and reviled, adored and despised, been the child of a poor prostitute and a courtesan revered by thousands. When I was a child, a stranger with no face offered me the ability to move between the worlds. Since then, my every death has led to a new life. I once had a true love. He was ripped away from me when I was murdered in the 18th century. I search for him still. In the meantime, I walk in the shadows behind the universe, visiting realms both exquisite and terrible and bringing back stories and rhymes to amaze the mind and enchant the ear. Through my YouTube channel, I send the stories out into the world, hoping that my true love will hear them and reply. Hoping, if he does not, that I will find in the other souls who listen kindred spirits to help ease the pain. What of you, stranger? Did you come here tonight seeking a mystery? Do you hunger for a spark of excitement, for the dark thrill of fear? Will you listen as my tales unfold, knowing that some may very well take on lives of their own? Consider, stranger, whether you have the courage to walk between the worlds with Seraphina, the Masked Lady. Hello, my delicious darlings. How are you this evening? Today's story is a long one, so I'll just say welcome and enjoy. Escaping the others. They were going to kill her husband in the morning. Lyra had known that even before the sirens had sounded. Before the green speakers dotted around the compound had started to wail and the voices, those awful, atonal, broken glass voices that made her feel like ants were crawling inside her skull, spoke, declaring her worst fear. The reality of what was coming broke her. Lyra didn't look for shelter. She didn't try to hide herself. She didn't conceal the prohibited emotion. She simply dropped to her knees and sobbed her heart out, knowing that the last spark of color and freedom in her world was about to be extinguished. The others had crossed into the world almost 30 years ago. Lyra thought about that sometimes, at the end of her day, lying on her cramped bed shelf and listening to the snores and occasional screams of her hutmates. She thought about her mother. Ella Mason had birthed Lyra just 4 years before the others had broken into their universe. Lyra sometimes tried to imagine what life would have been like before the others had upended the world. Ella had been privileged. Yes, she had died at the age of 30, thin and worn out from months of running, but she'd had 25 full years to spend as she wished. 25 years in a world of music, films, fun, and laughter. 25 years without the others. Lyra pictured a happy childhood. She imagined homework, study groups, and parties on weekend nights. Imagined summer trips to the beach and the poignant bittersweetness of teenage friendship. She imagined flirting dates and first kisses. She imagined taking her first lover. There had been times when Lyra had tried to envisage what passion felt like. Sadly, she lacked enough information to properly fantasize. Lovemaking had been common in the world pre-others. Lyra knew that. Humanity had possessed so many things. Before that summer, before people had seen the air around them thin and strange translucent figures had appeared, flickering like images projected onto a piece of fabric. Before the figures had assumed recognizable faces. At first, scientific minds had dismissed the images as visual hallucinations. It had been hot that summer, hotter than ever before, and the figures had had so much in common with the sickening shimmer of heat haze it had been easy to draw the comparison. The general advice had been that people should stay inside, in air-conditioned rooms or in front of fans, if air conditioning was unavailable. At a stretch, people were told to lie in cold baths with cool compresses on their heads. Time off work was to be taken if necessary. Better that than the whole of the northern hemisphere plunge into madness. People had obeyed. At first, it worked. The frequency of sightings had reduced. Public anxiety had lessened. Then, just as the government had congratulated themselves on handling the situation, the images had started to speak. More figures had appeared. That they seemed to be human should have been comforting. The problem was that some of the faces were too familiar. At first in Britain, then worldwide, people looked at the beings and recognized lovers, husbands, and fathers. Reactions had ranged from amusement to hatred. Kids had pulled faces at the figures. Teenagers had flicked beer cans and cigarette butts at them. Adults tried to engage them in conversation. Eventually, one young man had elicited a reaction. He was the first to come face to face with his mirror image. When he'd looked into the creature's eyes, it had screamed. At the same time, all over the world, the images had started to scream too. Panic had followed. People had attacked the others with knives, guns, and even fire. Those who directly interacted with another collapsed, insensible, and never woke again. On the 32nd day after the screaming, millions had celebrated when the figures disappeared. A day later, the others had opened a portal from wherever they resided and stepped through. The others had congregated in areas of high population density. Initially, the killings had been sporadic, but they'd picked up quickly. One after another, the others hunted down their human twins and slaughtered them without mercy. After 6 months, the human population had been reduced by 2/3. Far too late, the military complex had launched its attack. It had taken another 5 months for the last surviving leader of the free world to surrender to the others. That had been Lyra's 5th birthday. A man she'd never met had signed away her life before it had even begun. Having known freedom, if only the cold and hungry kind, Lyra had at least been able to recognize her slavery when it began and to hate it. Sadly, Lyra had never been brave. Her rebellion had always ended at the first lick of pain. Dayton had been the brave one of the two of them, the selfless one. If it hadn't been for Dayton, Lyra would never have known freedom. He was the reason there had been any color in her life, any joy. She'd have liked to say that she loved Dayton as soon as she saw him, but that wasn't true. She'd been confused. Lyra had been 11 and Dayton 14. Lyra couldn't recall exactly what she had done wrong, but she could remember the agony of the other's lash as it had rained down upon her. She'd been huddled on the floor of the punishment square, sobbing between yelps, when she'd heard a set of footfalls approaching her. "Excuse me," a boy's voice had said, "but you are about to compromise the efficiency of that unit." The other had not paused in its work. "Unit, return to your task." "I can't," the boy had answered. "If you continue, the unit will break. Our hut will not be able to complete its assigned tasks." "Withdraw," the other had ordered. "Her punishment is not complete." "Then please," the boy had replied, "let me take the remaining lashes." By then, Lyra had been sure she was hallucinating. It had happened before. The boy couldn't be real. Punishments in the compound were severe and easy to come by. No human would be foolish enough to court harm on behalf of another. It must be desperation clouding her mind. Seconds later, the other had proved her wrong by lowering its arm and turning towards Dayton. "You," it had said, "are willing to take the rest of the unit's punishment." Lyra had peered under the other's arm at the boy, tall and handsome, with chestnut hair and warm green eyes, waiting for him to refuse. "If you will allow me," Dayton had replied. The other had hauled Lyra out of the square. "Go to the chapel of penitence," it had intoned. "I will collect you at midnight." Typically, 9 hours on her knees in a stone chapel would have been a horror, but Lyra had barely noticed the sentence. Instead, she'd stared in amazement at the handsome boy who smiled and winked at her even as the first lash struck his skin. Dayton had conspired to be a part of Lyra's life from that day on. Almost magically, he had been assigned to her work details. He had whispered jokes to her as they dug earth in the fields and had left her treats that should have been impossible to procure. Dayton had asked nothing of her. Lyra had been braced for a demand. For her time, effort, and body. It never came. That, above all, was what had made her love him. She'd been 15 and Dayton 18 the first time they'd tried to escape the compound. They'd made it 10 miles before being recaptured. The punishment had been terrible. It had taken another 5 years of gentle persuasion before Lyra had been confident enough to try again. For 8 blissful days, they had stayed ahead of pursuit. On the 9th, they'd been back in chains. Their final bid for a life of their own had occurred just last week. They had made it out of the compound. Traveling by day, when the sunlight seared the other's sensitive eyes, they had reached the caves in the mountains to the north of the city. Dayton worked in the engineering unit. His cleverness was the coin with which he'd purchased time with Lyra. He'd heard tell of a tunnel that reached deep through the mountain. On the other side, he promised, was a place where the others could not go. Somehow, the sound bouncing off the rocks scrambled their senses. If they could get there, they would never have to go back. That night, they had lain naked in each other's arms. Despite their love, they had never before dared to join their bodies. If Lyra had kindled with a forbidden child, the others would have taken it as a slave, and that would have killed them both. They should have waited. Instead, so close to lasting freedom, they had finally been bold. Dayton had loved her. Lyra had shattered apart in his arms and come together again. She'd known from the start that they'd created a life. The others had caught them at dawn. Now, Dayton was going to die. When the sirens ceased wailing, Lyra was still sobbing in the dirt. A tall other with broad shoulders hauled Lyra to her feet. She waited numbly for her punishment. Instead of striking her, the other marched her forward until they reached a stone bench on the edge of the compound. The guard pressed her into a sitting position, then left. Lyra was confused until Dayton sat beside her, his hand grasping hers. "How are you here?" Lyra whispered. His voice was light, but it trembled. "Let's just say I offered them something they couldn't refuse. I heard the announcement." "Yes," he said, "the bastards are finally setting me free." Lyra tried not to sob. "I'm sorry." "Never be sorry." Dayton squeezed her hands so tightly it hurt. "I'm not." "How long do we have here?" "Not long. Maybe 5 minutes." Lyra's heart clenched. She had meant to take her greatest secret to her grave, not wanting to hurt him with it, but now it seemed a treasure that she had to share. "Dayton," she whispered, pressing his hand against her midriff, "I brought something back from the mountains with me." It took him a moment to understand. Baby, our baby." "No," Dayton whispered, "it can't be." "It is," Lyra said. "One of the other prisoners at the indenture house had a scanner. She told me." Dayton turned towards her. Lyra couldn't understand the horror on his face. She barely saw the knife before he stabbed her. "Dayton," Lyra whispered as he laid her gently back onto the dirt. He didn't answer. Instead, he pressed something jagged and silver into her right palm. "I'm sorry," he whispered. Lyra stared up at him, feeling herself start to die. Wanting to hate him but finding herself unable. When the words would not come, she squeezed his hand. His loving green eyes were the last things she saw before the world went black. And then it blinked back on again. The world was still there, but it was changed. She was on the same road, underneath the same sun, but the compound was gone. So were the others. Lyra could feel a breeze in her hair and hear seabirds calling. She looked at her wrists, and there were no manacles or scars. She looked at the glowing silver thing still clutched in her hand. "Oh, my love," Lyra breathed, understanding what Dayton had done. He was an engineer. He worked with other technology, and he had built her a miracle. Even on the brink of oblivion, Dayton had thought of her first. The stab wound had been for show. The transit had closed it. Knowing Lyra could not live without him. Knowing it would kill her to watch him die. Dayton had conspired to take her out of his world and into another. At last, he had given her freedom. "I love you." Lyra could no longer see Dayton but prayed he heard the truth in every syllable. Lyra felt the child flutter within her. Whispering a prayer, she stood to greet her new world. Okay, tissues at the ready. I will admit that this story got me right in the feels. I'm so glad that Lyra and her child got the freedom she deserved. But what about Dayton? Do you think he will find a way to join Lyra in their baby in the new world, or will the others execute him as planned? What about you? Could you send someone you loved ahead to safety, even knowing you would never see them again? Personally, in all my lives and travels, I have never encountered anything more vital or more important than love. For there to be any hope in the universe, that must be a constant wherever we go. Thank you again for joining me on the channel. Have a lovely evening and enjoy the rest of your week. Good night.